Good afternoon. My name is Mrs. Carpenter. I'm a teacher of English, and I am here to talk to you about the key lessons I learned as a journalist. And I'm here with...
I'm Mr. Watson. I'm also an English teacher at Q3 Academy Langley. I'm ready to learn all about journalism. My degree is unfortunately in politics and philosophy, so I'm excited to learn all about this. So we might as well start. When did you start your journalism career?
So my journalism career started in 2019, and I started at City University in London, where I did my master's in newspaper journalism. And I spent a year studying to become a journalist. I spent my time interviewing members of parliament and famous celebrities, and I got involved in a little bit of political journalism as well. And it was a real rigorous training program. We would have regular sessions where our copies would sometimes be pulled to pieces, unfortunately, but that would be a kind of process to enable us to be better writers. And that course lasted for about approximately a year.
Yeah, it sounds like they kept you on your toes then, really, if you're interviewing everyone. Who would you say, well, who have you interviewed? Who have you interviewed? We'll start with that, and then we'll work up the big names. We'll start with who have you interviewed in your time?
So in my time, I've interviewed MP Meg Hillier. That was carried out in Parliament in the House of Commons, and I had about 45 minutes with her, and I asked her everything about her personal view on Brexit, on what she thought about how the country was run, and it was a very kind of insightful interview where she revealed what she really thought about the kind of the running of the country, and it did obviously become quite political, but it was an opportunity to for her to reveal her insight into the inner workings of Parliament, and what she honestly thought about Brexit.
Michelle's biggest name?
I would say it would have to be the Vamps. So I was fortunate enough to end up on a very, very classy boat going down the River Thames, interviewing the Vamps. They were also partway through a photo shoot at the time, and I was interviewing them about the release of their new album. Nice. At the time, and they were very confident, very full of life, but also very proud of their album that had just been released. You had lots of screaming fans when we were going past, sort of screaming their names, and obviously that had to be edited out of the copy. But it was really interesting to get to know the boys on a different level, actually who they were behind the scenes, and they were actually quite fun and relaxed. And that part of who they were was then able to kind of be written into the copy, and that's how you can kind of end up writing kind of colour into the copy, by finding out actually who these boys were and what they thought about the release of their new album.
It sounds like you needed to actually train yourself to ignore all of that going on the side of things, and actually get the right answers out, get the right questions out as well. But what do you think? Well, what did you learn while you were training? Become a journalist? What did you learn while training to become a journalist?
I learned so many things as a journalist. I learned about the morals and ethics of being a journalist, the law of being a journalist. I remember sitting in lectures for hours writing notes about journalism law, ethics and morals. So certain things in journalism law that you're not allowed to do. So the difference between privacy and also the public. So whether, for example, when it comes to photography and photographing celebrities, whether it's actually acceptable to take a picture of them in public, or actually is that deemed as a private moment. And sometimes these big news stories, particularly in these national papers like the Times, the Telegraph, the Sun, they would be sued hundreds of thousands of pounds all over a picture. Because for the celebrity, they felt as if that was an invasion into their private life. And it was about kind of debating through law whether that had been broken. And also in terms of journalism ethics, I remember when I had a go at kind of my local titles, there ended up being a dead body in a field, and I was kind of rushed to the scene, and I remember very much kind of family members being nearby, but it really was quite a difficult moral decision, because I had my editor on the phone saying to me, right, go take pictures of the dead body, release them over Twitter, release them on social media. And I just remember thinking, this doesn't feel morally and ethically acceptable, like that they want me to post the pictures all over social media. And I just remember feeling quite morally like confused, and I didn't feel as if it was something I could do. So I actually said to my editor, I'm really sorry, that's actually not something that I'm confident in doing. Even though they wanted to turn it into like a live news story and have me tweeting every single second, there's certain things that do test your moral character and actually what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do, which I found quite challenging at the time.
I imagine it's something you have to learn quite quickly as well, like where your line is. You have to learn that very quickly. If you end up with, it's not quite the vamps on a party boat in the Thames. It's a little bit different, but you have to figure out straight away exactly where you are. What would you say was maybe the most valuable lesson then that you learned, the most valuable lesson you learned as a journalist?
I'd say the most valuable lesson I learned as a journalist is giving companies or individuals that you're interviewing the right to reply. So, for example, I was doing a story at the time about a bride who had to cancel their wedding. It was very sad. They spent so much money on this wedding. You can imagine thousands and thousands of pounds have been poured into this beautiful wedding day. But because of coronavirus, it was cancelled. Yeah. And I remember writing up that story at the time, based off kind of, certain facts and everything as well. But there was also companies that were involved in the wedding day that had let her down in the running up to it. And actually what I learned was, it's so important to give those companies who were involved in that wedding process, caterers, etc., the right to reply, because they hadn't delivered on what they were meant to have delivered on. And then that's so important, because whenever you're writing a news story, you need to give people the right to reply. You can't, and even if it just means literally picking up the phone and saying, a story's been written on X, Y, and Z. I'm giving you the right to reply. What is your comment on it? Yeah. Whereas if you don't do that and you just leave it, that can come back on you, and then you have to have journalists and lawyers interfering and so forth. Then it becomes a bit of a. So you got to be really careful. You have to be really careful, and you have to fact check all of your work. You can't assume anything. Yeah. Imagine that the general public don't know anything. So when you're going in there, you have to ascertain all of the facts: when, where, what, who, why, and even little details that you don't think are important end up becoming the biggest part of the story. Yes. Even from details of as in what people are wearing, all of these kind of things, that can add the colour into your piece and make it quite gripping. Yeah. But of course, you have to be also careful about not embellishing news stories. Of course, yes. And not exaggerating. You have to just stick to the facts. But of course, that can be quite hard to balance when you're also writing to a particular title. So, for example, The Sun, in my opinion, can be quite exaggerated, a bit over the top. They're trying to sell. Mail Online is the same. Yeah. They can be quite exaggerated, and it can feel a little bit over the top. I remember the Mail said to me, right, an Amazon driver, unfortunately, they were driving down the road and someone's now literally fallen underneath the lorry. Can you go and interview the parents about how they feel that their son's died because an Amazon driver's just literally ploughed over them? And again, that was quite a hard one to do. And I actually found that really, really difficult.
Oh yeah, I can imagine it would be like and actually it was interesting what you said about knowing what to write for who, really, about those different levels of things. So you talked about the sort of more headline gripping side of things. Do you ever do any, like really just, these are the facts, that's your lot? Do you ever do any of that?
Absolutely. So my editor, particularly when I was working on one of the Hampshire titles, said to me, right, unfortunately, it looks as if there's been a massive fire. Can you go down, report, go down now, get live tweets, everything out on socials, find out what happened, when it started, talk to the locals, gather the story, get the evidence down, use your shorthand to write down everything that's happened, come back, quickly type it up, I'll look over it, verify it, and then we'll send it to print. But the turnarounds of some of the copy was so tight. I remember I had a phone call from my editor from one of the Hampshire titles saying, right, a story's just broken. She rang me at 3 a.m. Right,
there's no respect for.
There's a fire. Literally, go down, get pictures, go talk to the locals, and go get that story.
Yeah.
I thought, oh my goodness, it's 3 a.m. I don't even know where I am. And I just remember literally climbing into my car, driving down the road, thinking, am I going to make it on time? 3 a.m. I can barely see. It's so dark. But there was even though there was a real pressure to it, it felt quite exhilarating because it's, oh, this is a story, it's going to go out live. And when stories did well on social, you always knew about it. I think one of my stories had between 500,000 to 1 million views.
Really?
And then often if a story goes, if it's so popular, it was a McDonald's story, I think I did.
When
a story becomes so popular, the nationals end up picking it up. And then they take that copy and they turn it into an even bigger story. Amazing. So that feels quite rewarding actually when you have a smaller story, or well, from a local title, and then the nationals make it into a bigger story. And that was a McDonald's one, because McDonald's brought out this like new exciting menu, and then there was like a massive queue, like literally there was probably like 1,000 people all like snaking around the car park. Like the car park was so busy, and that just did so well. Like the videos, the visuals did so well. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, this story has completely exploded.
Yeah, that was your moment.
That was my moment.
Brilliant.
Absolutely.
A little bit of a different note now. I'm almost scared to ask. What do you think was maybe the most terrifying moment you've experienced in this?
When I was a freelance journalist working for The Telegraph, I had an absolutely terrifying editor who was really, really strict when it came to spelling, punctuation, and grammar. If I did not put the comma in the perfect place, if I did not put the semicolon in that perfect place, I would get fried alive. I would get so done off. In fact, you just know, you'd be almost too scared to go back into the office the next day, because you would know automatically what was waiting.
You knew exactly what the first topic of discussion was going to be in the office, was this person's misusing apostrophe on the 14th line.
You get pulled from different stories. So the editor would be like, well, you've made this mistake, I'm not going to put you on different stories. And then you'd have to fight really hard to get back, pitch more stories, and get back in the game. It really did feel like I was in a game. But it was rewarding when those stories went out there, and knowing that the whole country was reading your work. Or maybe not the whole country, but a lot of the Telegraph had a lot of readers. So.
It sounds like you had the odd moment where it would have been the whole country, and it would have blown up in a big way. Do you think that actually that strictness, whereabouts did that strict sort of editor come in your journalism career? Was that the start of it, or maybe?
I would say fairly near. So when I was studying my master's in newspaper journalism at City University in London, I worked some shifts at the Telegraph. And that's when I came across this very traditional, very strict, very grandfather figure like authority in journalism, but he really was the voice. If you didn't please him, if you didn't write in the way he wanted you to, if you missed something, you would suffer for it. 100%. And you would either have to work hours and hours to gain back his trust, to prove yourself. It was constantly proving yourself in those early years of journalism. And I just remember the pressure. And I was also competing against my City University graduates. Like all of them were wanting shifts at the Telegraph. People were getting shifts at the Times, all sorts. So it was constantly competitive.
It has I don't know much about journalism, but I know that I mentioned before I lived with a journalism student for a few years. And it was just so brutal and competitive out there. And she was talking about these people that you're talking about now, about the people that would pick you up on the smallest thing, and then you were done. and you had to go find somewhere else, but everywhere else was fully booked. Like it just sounds like it was really so intense.
I would describe the industry as honestly cutthroat.
Yeah.
Not to be too pessimistic, but you have to have a real thick skin to survive in the industry.
Yeah.
And if you are sort of seen as weak or soft, maybe a little bit more emotional, you won't survive. It is really the survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
And your English is tested to the limits. Absolutely.
We'll come on to how that's affected you as an English teacher. I know you mentioned learning punctuation grammar. I saw a little bit of myself in that, so I can't really talk about that. But yeah, so how do you think sort of transactional skills you've pulled across from journalism, how do you think that's influenced you in the classroom and the teacher you are now?
So transactional skills has been absolutely essential to my teaching practice. I would say even from teaching children transactional writing, from a kind of key stage 3 level, has been absolutely vital. But what I've learned with all these fancy words that I've learned, like subheadings, stand first, bylines, the students wouldn't know all of this journalism jargon. So I've had to really, really kind of strip it back, simplify it, and break it down for them in a way that they understand. But I would teach them, for example, when they're saying in a news story what's happened, any good news story never reveals everything all at once. You wouldn't say when, why, where, what, all of it at once. You would trickle that information over a news story, but you wouldn't reveal, because if you reveal all information all at once, the reader's then bored, they're switching off.
Well, it's about engagement, isn't it? If you give them everything at the start, like your introduction has the ending, then why would you read that? You're not going to carry on reading that. So you need to space it out.
But there's been certain misconceptions that I've been able to pick up very quickly in terms of students like to write rhetorical questions in a news story, but you can't really write that in a hard-hitting, cold news story.
No.
That would be more for like a feature writing or feature piece. And it's about teaching students when that would be appropriate to include rhetorical questions.
Going back on some of the things you mentioned before, like if I was reading a story about a dead body, I don't think I personally would fancy a rhetorical question like, how would you feel in this situation? I don't think that would, I would go, this isn't a professional establishment, I'm not reading the rest of this. But you see it so much in English, don't you? You see it so much in the writing. But you think you've learned how to pick that out and teach it in such a way that it's more consistent and, don't say genuine, but close to actual real life writing. I think you found that because of these experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if anything, my life as a journalist in my early 20s to mid 20s has taught me all of these kind of fundamental lessons that I've then been able to impart onto children. And I think actually everything that I've learned has not been a waste, because actually I've just been able to put it back into the classroom and teach the next generation, because there's a lot of young people out there who are very enthusiastic about journalism and want to become journalists themselves. And I've been able to kind of impart some sort of key knowledge about what it really takes as well to become a successful journalist. And the do's and don'ts of journalism.
But then even before you get there, the standard that they need to be working at if they do want to go into this, you can like teach that across. You can show that, you can demonstrate that, and say, well, because there are students even in year 7 that we teach that like, oh, I want to be a journalist. I want to go into these stories and write these pieces, and then they grow up and hopefully that develops and they go into this career. Do you think you're more able to point them in the right direction, even before getting to the professionalism side of it, just in terms of the writing and what's needed to even get noticed in this really competitive sphere? Do you think you're more capable of doing that?
Absolutely. I feel like with my journalism background and also interviewing all those different people, I even interviewed someone else I want to mention just before I answer your question, is I managed to interview the security guard of the late Diana in the royal family. I interviewed her security guard called Ken Worf, and it was really interesting what he thought about Diana's death. He didn't actually believe that Diana was killed accidentally. He believed that it was the paparazzi and other influences that caused her death. And I remember interviewing him at the time and thinking, what an interesting man, that he was with her in those most kind of private moments and knew her, and probably was one of those people that knew her the most, but a lot of people would have overlooked and not really thought much of.
Yeah, well, it's true. Why would you be interested? But then you're right, he sees her in the most vulnerable and the most personal moments as well, and will just know her as a person. So you mentioned that one, I want to say that's for some different publishers, probably the single biggest story that will ever happen. How do you deal with something so argumentative, where, because so many people are like, oh no, she was killed, but people are like, it was an accident. How do you ride the middle line? If you did ride the middle line, how do you show both sides of it in one single piece?
I think the safest way of writing a story like this is writing from fact. What factually happened? Factually happened was that Diana was in a car. She was taken by the taxi driver, and then she had other cars chasing her afterwards, and then that eventually caused the crash. But it's about factually talking about what actually happened. We have to be very careful in journalism of speculation, of things that might have happened or could have happened. And of course, everyone's obviously got their real thoughts about what really happened behind kind of closed doors. But again, it's about being really careful and certain about the facts, because that is what goes up to the public. And if anything is factually incorrect, it has to be retracted, or there even needs to be an apology from the newspaper.
So you still need to make sure you get things exactly right before.
And I would say,
get to the writing stage, it sounds like.
Absolutely. But going back to your question, I didn't answer your question before about what would make me help those. Why would I be the best person to lead them in that direction? Well, I think it's because of my background experience in journalism, actually being a journalist, working for British national newspapers like the Times, the Telegraph, the Sun, the Mail Online, the Mail, and also regional newspapers as well. Basingstoke Gazette, Andover Advertiser, Cambridge News. I worked for all of these different titles. And because I've been in the industry, I know what it's like. I know the day-to-day. And using all of my knowledge, I can then impart all of my experiences onto young people and teach them what they need to know about the industry. Because a lot of this information hasn't just fallen at my feet. I've had to seek out opportunities in journalism, do different shifts for different papers, and find out how each newspaper works.
Just an excessive amount of work before you even start.
100%.
It's just so much research before we start.
And the hours. I mean, no one talks about the hours, but actually, I was pulling. I'm not even joking. 50, 60 hours a week, maybe more.
We're meant to be promoting journalism.
I mean, the hours were absolutely madness, but it's an industry that you either love and you just fall into, and you're happy with those hours. But I'd say those hours were particularly bad in regional newspaper journalism.
Well, you have to be anywhere and everywhere, don't you? Like you mentioned earlier about how you got a call saying something's happening, go now. Was that your contracted time, or were you just expected to go straight to it?
It was just an expectation. It wasn't even contracted. It was just an expectation for me to like grab my pen and paper, make sure I'm in the mind of my my shorthand, which I'd use all the time because I haven't got time to write it all out. Even have my recorder and everything ready, phone ready to take pictures of the scene, and just go flee in the middle of the night. And imagine, if you have a family, or if you have, if you're married, that's very, very difficult to be able to kind of maintain that. But of course, at the time, it was kind of quite easy to just go out there, but I was very, very tired. The hours were
I imagine it's fun when it's happening, but then as soon as you sit down after a long piece of. So you've mentioned it a little bit about sort of the ins and outs of the publishing world of it. How would the morals and the ethics of journalism play out? You touched on it briefly, but then also, within the day-to-day, you mentioned about things that you had to talk about, things you had to leave out, and how to structure things. So how would the morals and the ethics of journalism impact the day-to-day operations?
So constantly in the morning, when you are in the newsroom, the editor has loads of stories that are on their agenda. Now, there's normally one of those stories on the agenda that you're not going to agree with. I remember at the time, we had a mock scenario situation
This is a
where
announcement. If Halima Ali is still in the building, could you please report to reception? That's Halima Ali to reception. Thank you.
anyway, moving onwards.
Professionalism is horrible. Yeah,
anyway, moving onwards, I would say there was a moment where this really brought into question my ethics and morals. So there was a picture released, 9/11, and there was bodies literally leaping, jumping off the Twin Towers buildings. And the decision in the newsroom in this mock scenario situation was, as journalists, do we publish the images of these individuals jumping from buildings? Is this seen as, is this an issue of privacy, or is this within the public interest? Is it too graphic to actually publish an image like that? Does the public need to know? And this was debated for hours and hours.
Such a massive issue, surely.
It was a huge issue because half of the newsroom was saying, yes, let's publish the picture of these people jumping from the Twin Towers building. And then you had the other half of the newsroom who was saying, oh, actually, no, I don't think we need to go into this detail. I don't think that this is within the public interest. So there was this constant tug of war between actually, do we publish it or do we not?
Do you think that's an argument between I don't know whether it's personal versus professional? The whole sort of, well, this is the news, we're reporting the news, versus this is someone's life, and this is something really personal, and it's such a tragic event. Do you think there's that professional side of it, like these are the facts, we are going to tell them no matter what? And do you think that conflicts with your personal sort of, because you mentioned you were against it, I'm assuming that was because the whole sort of, this is a person's life, it's unfortunately.
I felt that I was more edging towards being against the publication of the picture because I felt like it was an invasion of their lives. And did we really need to broadcast this to the entire world? Yes, on one side, it would have published more newspapers and the newspapers would have made more money. But in my opinion, it really conflicted me morally because I was thinking, this is really going against who I am as an individual. And I thought, this doesn't feel natural. But because the editor had the overall decision, despite what a lot of people would have thought in the mock scenario situation in the newsroom, it was published anyway.
Despite your views.
Despite my views. But if you go back in time to 9/11 and the news that came out.
This is staff announcement, student search located. Thank you.
Going back to 9/11, if you look at the news stories that came out at that time, the editors of all the British national newspapers decided to publish that picture. Even though morally, a lot of people wouldn't have agreed with it.
Do you think that's because, I mean, it was a different time back then, but I know nowadays there's a lot of quick engagement. That's the big topic, is quick engagement. How do you get people to click on it and to stay on it? Do you think there was a little bit of that sort of seeping through in choosing to publish that picture to such the extent? Or do you think that it was just, like I said, the facts and just the facts? Or do you think it was a little bit of, well, this will get more people to buy it, get more people to read
I think it's a mixture of fact and being over sensational.
Yeah, of course.
And being over sensational with it. Because yes, the newspapers needed to publish it. And yes, it really was that horrific. It really probably was one of the worst catastrophic human events in human history. Absolutely. But at the same time, it was still fact. But I do think there was elements of sensationalism mixed with fact. But also, the world wanted to see what was going on. The world wanted to capture what was happening, whether it was through television screens, reports, but how that information was disseminated was really important because, again, it's people's lives. And these people wouldn't have had a right to reply because they would have died. So it was a very contentious issue at the time.
Well, it sounds like and everyone knew about it. Everyone wanted to know about what was happening there. So it must have been such a massive issue. Were you working for national at the time or regional at the time? Whereabouts were you?
I was working for national at the time.
National. Nice, excellent, yeah.
So that was quite interesting. Not actually in the 9/11 itself. No, but
in this scenario.
But in this scenario, I was working for national at the time.
Which of the national? You've mentioned a few. Which of the national publications did you most enjoy working for? Which one was the best for you?
I would say my favourite was probably the Sunday Times.
Yeah.
Of course, it was the best paid.
Yeah.
£300 a shift is nothing to be moaning about.
No, nothing to be sniffing at.
And that was only for a few hours.
Yeah.
And that would have only gone up and up over time. I also enjoyed working for talk radio, but that was more video journalism, audio journalism, less
recording it rather than you didn't get time to practice a shorthand then.
Not really, no. That was more keeping the website alive and doing a few stories on the website. There was nothing hard hitting. I think what I found more demanding than anything was writing the copy for regional newspapers. I had to literally lay out an entire newspaper 2 hours on a Friday afternoon and make no mistakes and be perfect all the time. And the pressure to be perfect all the time was immense.
Yes,
you had to be perfect.
Yeah.
You had to spend hours and hours and hours and hours getting it right. And that was a lot on my shoulders in my early 20s.
Yeah, and you've already talked about what happened if you didn't get it right and suddenly you were out of favour in a way. So all of that pressure, all that building up. I know we mentioned it briefly earlier, national versus regional. You need to be on regional more all the time. You need to be national, presumably has a bigger audience. Which one has the higher pressure in terms of getting it perfect every time?
Oh, that's a tough one. I would say it's a real toss-up between the two, but overall I'm veering towards regional.
Yeah.
Because it was smaller, more eyes were on you.
Yeah.
National, you were one writer in many.
Of course, yeah. You were replaceable. Let's be honest. Let's be blunt about this. If you're working for a national newspaper and you send in something that's got too many spelling mistakes, they send it something else. Regional, I imagine you're 5 people in that little office, maybe 6. And of that, one of them is constantly over your shoulder staring at you, making sure you use your semicolons correctly. Like it's all. I imagine the pressure must have been so much harder. Speaking of pressures and being over the shoulder about semicolons, how do you think journalism's impacted you as a secondary school teacher? How do you think you've brought that into this bit of your career?
I think from my journalism career, I've taken with me the fundamental aspects of spelling, punctuation and grammar, my editor being so over the top. I've almost become a perfectionist as a teacher. I think what sometimes happens as a teacher is I'm too hard on myself. And actually, it's important to be self-reflective. Yes, we shouldn't punish ourselves for it. We are, at the end of the day, we're human beings. Human error from time to time can be quite natural. So I've kind of learned to forgive myself quicker if things go wrong, rather than ruminating on things for months and months on end. It's important to just realise, okay, that didn't happen, didn't go quite right. I'm going to pick myself up and carry on. Yeah.
Do you find you're holding yourself to the same standards you were held to? So you teach year 7, they are 11 and they are 12.
Yeah.
Do you find yourself at the exact same standard that you were being held to when you started in journalism with these editors on your back?
I would still say yes, because I think there's intense scrutiny of any teacher in the early stages of their career. Yeah. Because early career teachers are brand new to the classroom, in my case, hadn't stepped into a classroom ever before, we're held under much heavier scrutiny. And the pressure there is absolutely extreme. So I would say the pressure is probably more in the teaching profession, or on par probably with journalism. But it's about going back to the idea of your subject. Yeah. Do you love your subject? Yes, I love English. Do I want to impart everything I've learned into these young people's lives? Absolutely. Yeah. Am I enthusiastic about my subject? 1,000,000,000%. Do I see myself in teaching in the next 30 years? Definitely. Yeah. So I ask myself those questions constantly as a reminder about why I'm in the profession that I'm
Yeah.
in. And yes, there's scrutiny. Yes, it's hard. Yes, we're under a magnifying glass, but actually, in the long term, it's definitely worth it. It's worth it because it's rewarding.
Yeah.
I'm in it for the children. I'm in it for them. I want to see them progress. And I want to give them the education that I was privileged enough to receive earlier in my life.
Yeah. Do you find yourself ever slipping into maybe an editor persona when you're marking an assessment and they've not used a comma, they're not used to full stop? Do you ever find yourself writing off the whole thing just because that's what you're used to?
Absolutely. I think it becomes, and we have to be so careful of that as teachers, that we don't just write children off because they've done one thing wrong. And actually, we need more of a holistic view of their work rather than turning into my editor and writing them off just because they've made a mistake.
Yeah.
But that's something that I battle with as a teacher because of my hard journalism background and the pressures that I was under from day one.
Well, if from day one you will get it right first time, and if you get it wrong, then there might be a second chance if you're lucky.
Or you're fired.
You're
fired.
I said second chance if you're lucky, right? But then because they're so much younger and they don't have that education that we have and you obviously had at the time, then the pressures that you're putting on them are different pressures put on you. But I feel like sometimes, and I'm the same. When you said about writing someone off because they missed you, dear me, I know I do that. I'm like, no, I'm not marking the rest of this. But then you do, and it's really good. And actually, sometimes you just need to separate yourself from the perfectionist and recognize where they are. Yeah. That's the thing. Talked about your teaching, talked about your journalism. What would be the best piece of advice that you could give as a teacher to a young person who is interested or is just beginning a career in journalism? Someone came up to you, said, "You've had this career. What can you tell me to help?" What are you saying to them?
I would say, honestly, if you really love journalism and you live and breathe writing and you want to go and report what's going on around the world, follow your dream. Live your life with passion. Go and pursue opportunities in journalism, even if you're writing for your great grandfather or your uncle on a Saturday shift that's not very popular, but it gets your name out there.
Yeah.
You need to hunt these opportunities out. They're never going to fall at your feet unless you seem to know everyone in the world. Use your contacts around you. But if it's something that you want to do and you don't mind being scrutinized for a long time and
working
long hours, then
not having a weekend.
Then go and do it. Go find out. Because you can only really learn by doing. Yeah. And I learned by doing. A lot of people said to me, "Oh, are you sure about this? Are you sure it's the right thing?" Well, to go and find out.
Did you have a lot of are you sure this is for you?
Yes. A lot of sit down conversations. Are you sure you're making the right decision? Is this something that you want to do?
Are you sure?
Honestly, it became it was so repetitive. I thought, I knew it came from a place of just being considerate and kind and caring, but actually it did make me interrogate myself more and think, is it something that I want to do?
Yeah.
Do I want to be behind a desk all day writing loads of stories?
But then because you were devoted to that lifestyle at the time, because it's a lifestyle, isn't it? Like you already said, the long hours, the short weekends, the thing. It's a lifestyle. You need to devote to that, and about getting your foot in the door and starting. It doesn't matter how small, as long as you're writing, someone will be reading, and no matter who that is, if it's the right person, eventually, it's a look at the draw, isn't it? Look at the draw in terms of actually making it in a sense. But you've worked for regional, you've worked for national, so you've seen the whole way through. Did you ever, while you were in school, were you a school newspaper writer? Your school newspaper?
Do you know what? That was the one thing I feel like I should have done. Yeah. I should have been involved in the school newspaper. But I do feel like I made up for it because when I went to the University of East Anglia and I did my BA in English and American Literature, I got involved in the student newspaper. Yeah. And shock horror, I became the science editor. Science editor. Science. I was a great science editor. Okay. I didn't quite want to be editor in chief because seemed more hours. I was quite happy with my position as science editor, and that gave me a little bit of taste of journalism before actually going into it, but obviously on a much smaller level. Yeah.
Anything else you want to say? Any other advice Bring forward.
Just to bring it back round, lessons I learned as a journalist are be true to yourself.
Yes.
If you're not comfortable doing it, is it a publication that you actually want to write for?
Yes.
When it comes up to transactional writing, make sure when you're teaching it to the children in the classroom that you're not using confusing, jargony words that they won't understand. Just strip it back and chunk it. Yeah. Scaffold that information. Don't give it to them all at once, because that's for them is cognitive overload and they won't be able to cope. Just think very strategically about the way that you want to present that information and what is the outcome of that learning for them.
What's the outcome of this specific learning episode before the whole picture?
And what I like to do when I'm doing transactional writing is sometimes when I'm doing lesson planning, I would do what I call a 5-minute lesson plan. I would literally quickly write it up on a bit of paper so I knew what I was doing before I'd even started.
Yes, of course. I do the same. You start with what they're going to be finishing with, and then you work backwards and you introduce something.
Absolutely. And I think if you do those things, you're not going to go far wrong.
That's it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much.